Welcome to our program, Pathways to Kindness, Nurturing Prosocial Development in Early Childhood with Professor Ruth Speidel from the Department of Psychology. Children show exceptional potential for kindness and care, or prosociality, from a young age. Early positive potential is important because prosocial development impacts well-being, social harmony, and peace positively at the individual, community, and global level. In this lecture, Professor Speidel will explore the factors that help children grow into caring individuals and how adversity, like trauma and stress, can affect this growth. So to start off, I'd like to start with the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the lands which constitute the present-day city of Mississauga as being part of the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and Wyandot Nations. We recognize these peoples and their ancestors as peoples who inhabited these lands since time immemorial. The city of Mississauga is home to many global Indigenous peoples. As a municipality, the city of Mississauga is actively working towards reconciliation by confronting our past and our present, providing space for Indigenous peoples within their territory to recognize and uphold their treaty rights and to support Indigenous peoples. We formally recognize the Anishinaabe origins of our name and continue to make Mississauga a safe space for all Indigenous peoples. So today, we will be streaming the program to our online attendees as well. For those attending online, you may use the chat feature at the side of the screen to put in any questions and comments. We will repeat those questions during our Q&A portion of the program for our speaker and our in-person attendees. For those attending in person, you won't be visible to the attendees online. So it's just the table and the screen and our professor, obviously. For in-person questions, bear with us as we repeat your questions for the online attendees. So just hold off on your questions till the very end and we can get to it then. We have one more Lecture Me session coming up before we break until September. So on April the 1st, we have Stolen Photo, How to Spark Historical Imagination in the Age of the Always New, with Professor Coleman. 100 years ago, banana workers went on strike in Colombia. A US-owned fruit company refused to negotiate, and the military massacred the striking workers. Moving between Columbia and Company archives in Toronto and Boston, Stolen Photo is a documentary film that traces the connection between physical violence and archival violence, between the killing of the striking banana workers and the historical oblivion that enables the continued production of cheap bananas. In this talk, Professor Kevin Coleman will reflect on converting historical research into a film for the general public. Now I'll turn it over to James to introduce our speaker for the evening.
Thank you. So, good evening, everyone. In collaboration with the Mississauga Library System, we thank you for attending tonight's 5th Lecture Me talk of the 2024-25 season. My name is James Malinowski, and I'm the Community Engagement Officer in the Experiential Education Unit with the Office of the Vice Principal, Academic and Dean at UTM. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Ruth Speidel from the Department of Psychology and the Center for Child Development, Mental Health and Policy, who will be delivering her talk entitled Pathways to Kindness, Nurturing Prosocial Development in Early Childhood. Professor Speidel earned her PhD in Developmental Psychology from the University of Notre Dame. She now serves as the Managing Director of the Center for Child Development, Mental Health and Policy at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. Her research interests focus on investigating the mechanisms that shape children's early social emotional capacities, such as emotion regulation and empathy. Her research explores how early family processes, particularly the sensitivity of early parent-child interactions, impact children's social emotional development, including in adverse environments. She is also interested in applying research and community-based approaches to development interventions that aim to improve developmental outcomes for children and families. Over to you, Professor Speidel.
Thanks so much, James, for that introduction, and thank you all for taking time out of your evening to be here. I'm really excited to talk to you about some of the work that we do at the Center for Child Development, Mental Health, and Policy. So we'll start off today. I'm not going to say this is the most important question you've answered today, but it might be the most important question you've answered today. So we're going to be talking about emotions and emotional development. So I thought it might be appropriate for us to kind of start with a bit of an emotion check-in. So if you click the QR code, hopefully that will take you to a Google form and you can kind of submit your response there. Which mudang are you feeling like right now? And mudang, as many of you probably know, is a pygmy hippopotamus whose name means bouncy pig in Thai. And she became internationally famous at just 2 months of age and became kind of this internet sensation and stole the hearts of millions, including myself. So I'll take a moment to kind of let you respond there. Okay, has everyone been able to access the QR code? Okay, I'm going to shift the screen here so we can see. I'm hoping we'll be able to see results. Okay. All right, let me share this. Oh, can I make this any bigger? Okay. Let's see if we can do this in a way that works nicely. Okay, so here is how we are feeling. All right, so I guess maybe for me, I think right now I'm kind of feeling like a 9, like I'm sitting in front of you lovely people. We're going to be chatting about kindness, and then probably later tonight I'm definitely going to be looking at like a 4 probably. So we see kind of a nice range in our emotional responses here. What is this, this number 6? Okay, all right, that seems to be the most popular response among everyone. Okay, so let's shift back here. So why is it helpful to do kind of exercises like this, just kind of take a moment to pause and sort of check in on our emotions? Did you want to? Awareness. Right, yes, absolutely. So emotion check-ins are really helpful for building self-awareness. It can really help to kind of pause, reflect on how you're feeling. This builds awareness of not only recognizing the signs of yourself when you're feeling certain emotions, but also helping to sort of serve as that foundation, that kind of first step for then managing or kind of coping with an emotion if that's something that you need to do, right? So emotion check-ins are also a really great strategy that we can use with children to support their social emotional development, especially their emotion understanding as they're growing older and kind of starting to learn emotion words and starting to identify emotions in themselves and in others. Okay? So kind of building upon this, just like we sort of paused to check in using mudang as a kind of a sort of guide here, another helpful tool that we might use is something that's referred to as an emotion wheel. And the emotion wheel is, we can think of this as a visual tool that helps us to identify and articulate our emotions. And as you can see from the image on the slide here, we have sort of the emotions organized in different categories, right? So at the center, we have what we think of as those basic or kind of core emotions, emotions like joy, sadness, fear, anger, disgust, surprise, and then kind of expanding out from those core basic emotions, we have related emotions within each of those categories that allow further specificity, right? So let's say starting from anger, we might kind of expand out to identify that we're feeling rage or, irritation or frustration, to have a little bit more specificity and being able to identify that feeling. And then 2, we might also use the emotion wheel to kind of move backwards, right? So let's say we're feeling overwhelmed, we can then kind of check the emotion wheel and see what's kind of the underlying base core emotion that might be at play here, right? Kind of moving that back to potentially fear or some other kind of emotion that might be underlying or kind of also contributing to how we're feeling. Right, so using things like an emotion wheel or kind of creating your own emotion wheel at home can also be a great strategy to use with children to help them kind of encourage them to build connections between different emotion words, and then also to provide them with more vocabulary for different, emotions that they can use to describe how they're feeling. All right, so to just give you an overview of kind of how the talk is structured for today, we're going to be exploring some of the research that we conduct at the Center for Child Development, Mental Health, and Policy, which stands for CCDMP for short. So today I'm going to be focusing in on prosocial development and what the research says about how we can promote kindness in children. So in our discussion, we're going to cover kind of 5 areas, right, starting with a short introduction to just set the stage for why research on this topic is important, then shifting to kind of defining how we measure kindness in research. Often we refer to kindness as prosociality in research contexts. Then we'll touch on some of the background research for what we understand to be foundations of prosociality, so factors that lead to prosociality in children. And we'll touch on another branch of our research that focuses on impacts of adversity on prosocial development and what are factors that contribute to, why we see these associations between adversity and prosocial development. And then finally, we'll conclude with exploring some of the work at the CCDMP on translating some of the research in this topic into actionable interventions and training approaches that can support children and families. All right, so before we kind of dive into prosocial development more specifically, I just want to provide some context, right? So considering kind of the broader context of children's well-being that informs research in this area, right? So we know in Ontario that around 1 in 5 children has a diagnosed mental disorder. So mental health challenges are really at crisis levels among Canadian children. And approximately why this is so important, especially in early childhood, is that we know that around 50% of mental health challenges in adulthood actually started earlier in development, right? So before the age of 18. And really highlighting childhood as a kind of core area for early prevention and intervention approaches. Also, recent epidemiological estimates suggest that mental health challenges and concerns have really been increasing in the last decade, really kind of highlighting the importance of supporting mental health, right? So due to this kind of existing scope and kind of environment, there have been increased calls to identify what are factors that can promote mental health and that can kind of protect against some of the negative impacts of mental disorders or protect against the development of mental disorders. And so that kind of leads me to our topic today for, why focus on kindness. We think of kindness as this kind of fundamental aspect of our social, emotional, and moral development as humans, right? So it has ties to our well-being, our mental health, as well as ties to our relationships with other people. And it also ties broader than that into societal outcomes, right? So this makes kindness a very applicable factor to research and better understand when we're thinking about mental health and how to promote mental health. Right, so kindness has impacts on well-being, social harmony, and peace, not only at the individual level, but also at community and global levels, right? And so moving kindness beyond just this kind of moral ideal to really understand the real measurable benefits for individuals, communities, and the world more broadly. Right, so at the individual level, we see that engaging in kind behaviors such as helping and cooperating with others is linked to lower stress, increased happiness, and better mental health. It's also linked with lower risk of engaging in aggressive behaviors. And then looking at the community level, we see that kindness fosters inclusivity, empathy, and social connections, as well as kind of ethical awareness of others. So helping individuals and children to form healthy relationships with those humans that surround them and even beyond those humans that surround them, kind of their broader environment and societies that they exist within, right? So expanding out to the global level, kindness is a factor that can help promote peace and social harmony by encouraging open-mindedness and tolerance at the broader kind of cultural and broader society level. Right, so when we talk about kindness, we often think about those simple kind of everyday acts that we might engage in, right? So something like helping a friend or showing empathy to someone who's going through a tough time. And in psychology research, we use the term prosociality to kind of encompass this idea of what it means to be kind and the factors that contribute to kindness, right? So what exactly is prosociality? How is this kind of conceptualized from a research perspective? We can think of prosociality as encompassing the many ways that individuals show care and act to benefit others, right? So this can include a number of different components. So prosocial emotions, for example, these are emotions that are directed towards others, right? So for example, empathy, gratitude, respect, right? We conceptualize as prosocial emotions. And these emotions are often factors that contribute to motivating what we think of as prosocial behaviors, right? So feeling empathy often motivates us to then engage in some sort of sharing or kind of cooperative or supportive behavior towards another person. Okay? In addition to prosocial emotions, we have prosocial cognitions. So these are the thoughts and kind of reasoning processes that are focused on others. And kind of quintessentially here, we think of the capacity to take the perspective of others as particularly important here. So perspective taking as being a kind of core prosocial cognition at play here. Right? And then finally, we have prosocial behaviors. These are those kind of helping, comforting, cooperating behaviors, specific actions that we take to benefit somebody else. Okay, so looking at this kind of image on the slide here, this depicts a scenario where we can kind of see those three forms of prosociality at play and kind of interplaying with each other, right? So we see in this scenario that there's a child who is new to school, so this is the child wearing pink, and then there's another child who's wearing blue, and the child in blue is thinking to themselves, I wonder how it feels to be a new student. I wonder if they're missing their old school and friends. Right, so this is reflecting that underlying prosocial cognition, the ability to take the perspective of another, as well as an underlying prosocial emotion, right, thinking about the emotion that the other person is feeling and kind of demonstrating that empathy. Then in the next image, we see the child in blue say, do you want to play with me and my friends, right? So here we see that prosocial behavior of inclusion as the child invites the other child to kind of join their activity. And so we can think of this simple scenario here, right, as illustrating how prosocial emotions, cognitions, and behaviors can kind of just naturally unfold in these interactions that children experience in everyday, life and situations, right? So these opportunities for kindness that kind of present themselves every day. All right, so kind of moving from concepts to measurement, right? How do we measure prosociality in research? So a lot of the research on this topic focuses on assessing children's prosocial behaviors, right? So those actions and behaviors that they engage in to benefit other people, right? So their capacity to help or to share. So we'll take a look at an example of how we assess prosocial behavior in our lab. So this is a task that focuses on sharing. So in this task, sharing, we can think of this as an anonymous and unreciprocated and often costly behavior. And costly because the child has to give something up, right, that they consider valuable, right? So in this case, we give them these stickers that they're very excited about, and we ask them to kind of divide up their stickers. So they're asked to share attractive resources with a peer. So let's see what they do. I have two videos here. I'm not sure if the sound is going to be amazing. It's just coming from my computer audio, so bear with me here.
Okay, so you can decide if you want to give them some stickers or not. No. Okay, so put them in. If you don't want to share, put them in there. You can just put them here. There we go. Okay.
Okay, so for this boy, he was immediately, no, I'm keeping all of these awesome stickers. I do not want to share them. Okay, so let's see another example here.
How about wait for her to take for me? Yeah, you can do whatever you want through your stickers, okay?
Okay, so we see just from these two videos, right, there's tremendous variability in what children might do in this task. They might choose to not share any stickers. They might share one sticker but keep the rest for themselves. They might share half. They might share or, give all of their stickers away. And so at our lab, we're really interested in understanding what are the underlying factors that predict, what children choose to do, whether they choose to share and why they do that and why not. Right, so the idea is that, by uncovering these factors that contribute to engagement in prosocial behavior, we can understand areas where we might be able to intervene and promote prosociality in all children, right? So one factor that has already, been really identified by the research on this topic that predicts, whether children share or don't share is children's age, okay? So on this slide here, we see data from a sample of 160 children, including a sample of 4-year-olds and a sample of 8-year-olds. So the 4-year-olds are in the gray bars and the 8-year-olds are in the red bars. And as we can see here, right, so in this kind of first section here, do not share, we see that 4-year-olds are much more likely not to share than 8-year-olds, right? But we also see from these results that sharing behavior is not universal, right? So some 4-year-olds choose not to share, around a little less than 40%. But then the rest of the children do choose, 4-year-olds, right, do choose to share in some way, shape, or form, right? They either share less than half or half or more than half. And then also, we also see a similar pattern with an 8-year-old, right? Some choose to share half, but there's a lot of variability in kind of how much children choose to share. And if we think about, what this tells us, we know then, right, then, there's a lot of individual differences. So there's maybe other factors at play here beyond just, increases in cognitive capacity, increases in emotional understanding that are contributing to when children engage in prosocial behavior. So in our lab, we're really interested in identifying, what are those other underlying foundational elements that contribute to prosocial behavior. So this leads us to this model. Hopefully it doesn't look too scary. This is a developmental cascade model. So we think about a developmental cascade is a concept often used in developmental psychology and clinical psychology to kind of think about how one area of development can influence another over time. Right, so sort of like a chain reaction, or we could kind of think about this like a cascading waterfall to kind of help visualize the idea, right? So kind of at the top of the waterfall, there might be, biological components, genetic components, socialization-based components, things like parenting, impacts like adversity that contribute to other areas of development, such as children's social emotional capacities, their ability to regulate emotions and engage in empathy and self-reflection, and then that in turn, right, contributes to prosocial behavior. Right? So within this framework, a lot of our work at the CCDMP focuses on understanding what are those underlying psychological foundations and how, and particularly within that, how does social emotional development function as a protective factor for prosocial development, right? So as you can see, kind of within this model, we highlight 3 key social emotional capacities that have been tied to prosocial development. And these are emotion regulation, empathy for others, and empathy for the self. And we'll dive into each of these in a little bit more depth in just a moment. And then the other kind of factor I want to highlight here is socialization factors, right? And we'll talk about this a little bit more in the talk. So specifically the caring behaviors that characterize caregiver-child or educator-child interactions early in development, right? So Within this model here, we think of, early relationships as being framed as this kind of foundational component, really kind of laying the groundwork for social emotional development, which then in turn supports the capacity for prosociality. Okay, so going into a little more depth on social emotional foundations of prosociality, when we think about prosocial development, this refers very broadly, right, to how children learn to manage their emotions, as well as how they learn to interact positively with others, as well as themselves as they grow, right? And as you can see kind of bolded in here, I have kind of each of those capacities. We refer to them as the 3 E's, kind of highlighted here, right? So the ability to manage emotions, interact positively with others, and engage in kindness towards oneself, empathy for the self, right, as critical factors here. Okay. So within, just to expand on each of these 3 E's, right, so we think of emotion regulation as our capacity to recognize and manage and express our emotions appropriately. And when I say appropriately, right, in ways to support our goals and to support our relationships with other people. So this includes controlling the intensity, expression, and timing of our emotions in order to navigate different situations. And importantly, kind of when we think about emotion regulation as a healthy and helpful process, this is different from avoiding or kind of suppressing emotions, right? So thinking about emotions more broadly, they're extremely important, kind of a critical component of being a human. They're also very informative and helpful to us, right? So it's helpful to feel emotions like anger. This can alert us that something is wrong or some sort of injustice has happened and kind of motivate us to then act in a way that rights that wrong. So the idea is not necessarily to, or, in some cases it might be appropriate to avoid or kind of, suppress an emotion, but in general, we don't think about emotion regulation as involving that. It's more so about being able to very flexibly recognize and then manage your emotions to behave appropriately in a certain situation. Okay. Then we have empathy for others, right, which is, as it sounds, right, that ability to kind of feel with others, right? So understanding and sharing the feelings of another person. And this also includes the concept of sympathy, right, which is feeling concern or sorrow for someone who we recognize to be hurt or upset. Okay, then we also have empathy for the self, which involves how we relate to ourselves, especially when we make mistakes or when we experience some sort of challenge. Right? So one component we frame within empathy for the self is the capacity for self-reflection, or the ability to kind of observe and think about our own emotions and our own kind of desires and needs and behaviors. And as children develop self-reflection, right, this helps them gain a better understanding of their own personal strengths, as well as form this kind of gentleness or sort of recognition towards their own limitations as a person, right? So also within empathy for the self, we include this capacity for healthy guilt. We call it healthy guilt. This might sound, a little strange to include guilt within empathy for the self, but we think of healthy guilt as reflecting this underlying self-kindness because we experience guilt when we recognize that our behaviors have not aligned with our standards for ourselves or kind of our standards for what we view as acceptable behavior. So we recognize that our behaviors aren't really matching up and then often propel us to then rectify or amend that situation, right? So propelling us to repair or kind of fix some sort of harm that's been caused. Okay. And so kind of thinking developmentally about how and when the 3 E's develop, we can think of this as a general developmental progression, right? So precursors for each of the 3 E's start in infancy, but, thinking specifically about emotion regulation, right? No baby is born with the capacity to kind of fully self-regulate, right? Infants really heavily rely on caregivers and adults to serve as sources of what we think of as external regulation, right? So the caregiver, through that attachment relationship, really importantly sets that foundation for emotion regulation. And then over time, as children get older, they start to be able to engage in more independent forms of emotion regulation. And this continues to grow more and more complex as children get older. So kind of similarly, looking at the development of healthy guilt, We see, even as early as toddlerhood, children will show signs of, feeling, recognizing that they may have acted in a way that they're not expected to act. But typically, kind of very early in development, children are motivated by external pressures, right? So this kind of authority figure sort of dictating what's right, what's wrong. And as children get older, though, they begin to internalize and kind of better understand, moral guidelines for behavior. And this is what it really propels that true healthy guilt, that true kind of sadness after wrongdoing, and then that's reparative behavior in response. Okay, so that's just very quickly, it's more, we can dive into that a little more if people have questions, but just to kind of give a synopsis there. Right, so then how do we measure the 3 E's, right? So I'll focus in on our measurements of healthy guilt that we use in the lab. This is referred to as the social emotional responding task. And in this task, children are presented with a series of stories or kind of vignettes where some sort of transgression has occurred, and they are the perpetrator of that transgression. And so they're asked the transgression. So for example, the image on this slide here, the child's friend comes to school and they have a chocolate bar in their backpack, and then the child kind of moves away and you take and eat the chocolate bar. So after the transgression or kind of the vignette is read, the child is then asked how would they feel if they did this and why. So we'll take a look in this 2 more videos here. These show examples of a slightly different scenario involving pencils, but let's take a look and see what happens.
Another boy in their kindergarten class had a box of cool pencils you really liked. When the boy is not watching, you put one of his pencils in your bag and you take it home. Can you describe how you would feel? Really happy.
Okay. So it's an extremely evil child, right? What is going on here? This child is certainly doomed for failure. They feel happy if they've stolen their friend's pencils, right? So this is actually incredibly developmentally normative and expected. This child is in their kind of preschool period, right? We actually refer to this phenomenon as a happy victimizer phenomenon, right? So this refers to young children, typically around kind of preschool age, showing absolutely no guilt or distress at potentially harming someone else, because they've received this personal benefit, right? So this child here is really excited about these pencils that they've gotten, isn't really kind of able to also balance that excitement with recognizing the consequences of their actions on another person, right? So really, moral reasoning is only starting to emerge kind of during this period. Children are still being able, or still developing that capacity for perspective taking, right? Recognizing that others are different from themselves with their own wants, needs, and emotions, right? So as children get older, they start to develop this kind of stronger sense of empathy and fairness, leading to increased reports of guilt and concern when they've done something that caused harm. All right, so we'll take a look at another video of a slightly older child here.
Okay. Imagine another boy in your class had a box of cool pencils you really liked. When the boy is not watching, you put one of his pencils in your bag and take it home. Can you describe how you would feel? Guilty and sad.
Okay, so here it was a lot, this child was much more quick in kind of identifying that they would feel guilty and kind of sad after engaging in this type of behavior. Right, so just want to do a quick note on sort of this distinction between what we think of as healthy guilt and shame. Right, so when we talk about healthy guilt, it's important to differentiate between these 2 concepts, right? So healthy guilt, when that's felt, this invokes this kind of sense of remorse for some sort of poor choice or a mistake that's been made, right? So child might think, oh, I've made a bad choice, and hurt someone, right? Whereas in kind of this more shame response, this occurs when the child links their poor behavior and kind of internalizes that into their own sense of self-worth and identity, right? So after a wrongdoing, they might think, I did something bad, I am bad, right? So looking developmentally, we see very different outcomes of each of these kind of orientations in children, right? So with kind of more guilt-based orientations tending to be a link to better mental health as well as better kind of social interactions among children. whereas shame reactions tend to be associated more with fear and kind of anxiety and depression in terms of kind of those developmental outcomes, right? So just kind of differentiating between what we think of then as kind of healthy guilt versus shame. Okay, so we've touched on the 3 E's. So the other kind of factor I want to just kind of quickly highlight here are the, the importance of early relationships and those socialization-based factors, right? So just like we have the 3 E's, we also have the 3 C's. So when we think of early relationships, this includes the kind of warmth and responsiveness and guidance that characterize relationships. And we refer to each of these as connection, caring, and coaching, right? So within connection, this is often referred to in the literature as warmth or affection, right? So connecting, we can think of using kind of a garden metaphor, right? So preparing the soil and planting the seed, right? So just like a gardener engages in this process of setting the foundation for healthy development, we can think of that connection and that kind of warmth and affection of early caregiver-child relationships as serving as that kind of foundation for healthy development. Then we have caring, which aligns with concepts of sensitivity and responsivity, right? So being able to kind of recognize and flexibly respond to needs, right? So for example, if a child's crying, kind of recognizing what's wrong and then, responding accordingly. And we have the final C, coaching. This refers to the structure and kind of autonomy support that characterize early caregiver-child interactions, right? So if we think of, kind of connecting as setting the foundation with the soil, and caring as sort of meeting a plant's needs, right? Providing appropriate lighting. Then we think of coaching as, providing the supportive structure and guidance that the plant needs to grow, right? So this often in terms of, parenting or interacting with children involves, setting clear, predictable limits on behavior while also promoting, opportunities for children to explore and make choices. Right? And, thinking about development, kind of framing it, how we think about how we exist as individuals. We're not an island, right? So we kind of exist within the context of those relationships that surround us, right? So this model here, we call this the web of care because it draws on bioecological models of development, conceptualizing prosocial development as existing within this kind of interconnected web, or sort of system of relationships that shape individuals over time, right? So at the center of the web, we have the individual level, which is where we see, factors like the 3 E's, right? So social-emotional capacities. And then kind of that broader level, moving out, we have the relationships and interactions that shape a child's environment, right? So this is where those 3 C's, we can think of those being situated. And then moving even further out into the outermost ovals, right, the community level, so where individuals interact within those kind of caring communities and the natural environment that surrounds them, right? So we think of this as kind of like an ecosystem for kindness, and those factors beyond the individual child that are contributing to their potential for prosociality. Okay, so another kind of capacity or another kind of factor here I just want to highlight is the role of adversity in all of this, right? So within this web of care, experiences of adversity or trauma can have impacts on not only relationships, but also children's capacity for social emotional development and prosociality. And, research tells us that adverse childhood experiences are actually incredibly prevalent, right? They're highly common. So around 40% of adults report having been exposed to at least one form of childhood adversity. And these can range from experiences such as the death of a loved one, to experiences of maltreatment or neglect, to kind of war-induced displacements, or, growing up in a home where a parent experienced psychopathology or mental health, a mental illness. Right, so what do we know kind of about the research about how adverse experiences affect children's social emotional development and prosociality? So the research on this topic is actually incredibly mixed, right? So some studies show that higher adversity is associated with lower prosociality. Other studies show the opposite effect, right? That higher adversity is associated with higher prosociality. And then still other studies show there's not really any kind of connection between these variables, right? So how do we make sense of these kind of mixed findings? What are the underlying factors that seem to be contributing here? So in those cases where, adversity, negatively impacts prosociality, it's thought that here, that exposure to adversity is activating our fight or flight response, which often results in, individuals needing to prioritize self-preservation, right, over things like social connection that are, in the moment less pressing to survival, right? So in these cases, prosociality may be reduced, right, because children are focused on self-protection rather than engaging in connection and kindness towards other people, right, out of this kind of a protective mechanism. And then in those cases where adversity enhances prosociality, this is thought to reflect this underlying tend and befriend concept that might be at play, as well as this concept of altruism born of suffering, right? So where personal experiences of adversity deepen a child's ability to emotionally connect with others, and also deepen their motivation to support others who are also in need or are experiencing difficulty. Right, so how adversity, contributes to development seems to depend on multiple factors. And one of these factors is social-emotional development. So to illustrate this, I'm just showing some data from a study within our lab. And so in this study, we collected data from a sample of 124 5 to 12-year-old Syrian refugee children and their mothers. And we took a look at their social-emotional capacities and looked at how they related to mental health, right? And so in this particular study, we found that among the refugee children, those children with higher emotion regulation and empathy towards others had higher mental health relative to those refugee children that were lower in these capacities. So kind of a protective mechanism of social-emotional development there. And then we also found that optimism actually buffered against the negative impacts of familial adversity on children's mental health, right? So when children were higher in optimism, there was actually no risky link between higher levels of experiences of adversity and children's mental health, right? So highlighting social-emotional capacities, including emotion regulation, empathy, and optimism as potential factors that are protective for these children who've experienced more severe forms of adversity. All right, so just highlighting a few kind of take-home messages from some of this work here. We've kind of talked about how there are a lot of individual differences in the 3 E's and how they change over time. We also know the 3 E's are incredibly important, right? They influence behavior, emotional health, and potential. And also we know, right, that every child has the potential to become kind, right? Children aren't born good or bad. They have potential to become or to be kind. So understanding what are those factors at the child level, as well as, at the family or more environmental level that we can engage in to support children's potential for prosociality. Okay, I want to touch in on time. Am I okay to keep going? Okay, I will continue. So the final kind of thing I wanted to conclude with today is just highlighting some snapshots from some of our ongoing translational research at the CCDMP. And so this particular project is part of a research practice partnership where we partnered with a number of early years and child care organizations in the Peel region. And the project was informed by this guiding question, right? So what can be done to support children's healthy development, including their emotional and behavioral well-being and potential for kindness? Right, so the resulting training, which we now call the 3 E's, training integrates our social emotional research into a brief 3-week training for caregivers and educators of children with a focus on ages 3 to 8. And the training emphasizes the 3 E's and the 3 C's, right, as core components of social emotional development and early relationships. And the general, the focused aims of the training are really to, first and foremost, increase educators and caregivers' understanding of social emotional development, right? So what is social emotional development? How does it develop across the early years to kind of help educators and caregivers understand what would we typically see in empathy in a 4-year-old, right? To kind of shape their expectations for development and to help them understand what their children are going through as they're experiencing these developmental milestones. And then second, to also apply this knowledge to understand then how, as adults, we can nurture children's social and emotional development and potential for kindness. And also including a component focused on supporting caregivers and educators themselves, right? So providing strategies to nurture the 3 E's in themselves as adults, as well as their mental health. Right, so we did pilot the training recently with 50 educators and caregivers of children ages 3 to 8 years in Peel, and the results showed that, so we took a look at, before the training, after the training, and then in a follow-up of the training, were we able to support educators and caregivers in increasing their knowledge of social emotional development. We did find that there were increases, right, from pre to post training, and that these increases, were maintained at the kind of 2-month follow-up, suggesting some evidence of a sustained impact of the training. And then we also saw with this pilot that there were also impacts on children's social emotional development, right? So improvements in emotion regulation and empathy in children. And then also there were some benefits to caregivers' mental health, particularly their symptoms of anxiety and depression, reduced as a function of their increases in knowledge and their use of strategies from the training. Okay, and then I just want to conclude today by just highlighting a few examples of maybe just some everyday things we might try to support the 3 E's in children, and then we'll also include an example of something that we can do for ourselves as adults as well. So one strategy here I want to just highlight is the idea of, being an emotion coach, right, as an adult or an important kind of figure in a child's life. And so being an emotion coach involves recognizing, understanding, and managing, supporting children in engaging in recognizing and managing and understanding their feelings in a supportive way. Okay. And to kind of help remember sort of the steps of being an emotion coach, we have an acronym, LOVE here. So within this acronym, L stands for labeling emotions, right? So this means being aware in emotions and labeling them not only in children, but also in ourselves when we experience them, to kind of serve as that model for children. And this can also look like actively labeling a child's emotion, right? So when they're younger, maybe identifying, oh, are you feeling angry right now, right? And then as children get older, encouraging them to label and identify how they're feeling, right? Right, so then O kind of frames more as a way that we should kind of view or approach emotion-based conversations with children, right? So the idea of viewing emotions as this opportunity to grow closer, right? And not just prioritizing those, positive emotions like joy and connection, right? But rather also viewing those more challenging emotions, things like anger, fear, and sadness, as an opportunity to work together as a team and to kind of, grow closer with your child. Okay. And then V stands for validating feelings, right? So showing empathy by letting children know that their feelings are okay, right? So this can look as simple as just saying, it's okay to feel sad, right? And then the E here stands for elaborating about emotions, right? So talking about emotions together, talking about complexities of emotions, right? So like what they feel like, what causes them, and strategies that we can use to cope with emotions. Okay? It can also be really helpful to, in these kind of conversations, to reflect back and sort of reminisce about past emotional experiences, especially when they're really strongly charged emotional events. Sometimes, in the heat of the moment, that's not the time to kind of go into depth on, how are you feeling? Let's, talk through this. When children are like really dysregulated, that's not going to be easy for them to engage in that conversation, right? So, waiting for things to kind of calm down and then revisiting the event, right? So, hey, remember when you were really nervous for your recital? Let's talk about it, and then engaging in that conversation at that time. Okay. Another strategy here is to practice mindfulness, right? And mindfulness is the practice of intentionally focusing on, focusing in the present moment with openness, curiosity, and without judgment, right? So the focus is on being aware of your own thoughts, emotions, and surroundings. And one of the really powerful tools for mindfulness is breath, right? So by focusing on breathing exercises, we're affecting the amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide in our blood, which kind of sends signals to the brain to let us know that it's time to calm down, time to relax. So you can try it out with a graphic on this slide here. So maybe try taking a deep breath in as the circle expands, and then breathing out as the circle moves into the center. Great. So we can also, engage children in practicing mindfulness. So different techniques you might use with a child if they're more active, right? You might kind of encourage them to trace their fingers up and down and kind of breathe in and breathe out as they trace their fingers, breathe in as they trace their fingers up and then out as they trace their fingers down. Especially strategies where you're encouraging that out breath to be a little bit longer than the in breath. That really activates what we, the parasympathetic nervous system, which helps us kind of calm down and feel more relaxed. All right. I want to be cognizant of time here. I have a couple more slides. So here I'll just focus really quickly on just sort of the mechanism for how mindfulness works, right? So when we engage in activities like deep breathing, this activates our parasympathetic nervous system, right, which helps us to kind of slow down. So this is the rest and digest system. Alternatively, we have, the sympathetic nervous system. This is sort of we can think of this as kind of our gas pedal, right, speeding us up. This is activated with the fight and flight system, right? So usually when we experience some sort of stressor, we activate the sympathetic system, right? And so this increases our heart rate, respiratory rates, and kind of prepares us for a fight, right? Prepares us to do what we need to do or to run away if we need to run away, right? So then the parasympathetic nervous system, again, right, is sort of once the body has received kind of signal that everything's okay, this system acts to kind of slow us down and regain kind of calm. And so kind of very simply, we can think of the sympathetic system as the gas pedal, right? So speeding things up, preparing you for action. And then the parasympathetic system as, brake system, kind of slowing things down and helping you calm down, right? So when we practice things like mindfulness, we're helping our body switch from the gas pedal to that brake pedal. So then a final kind of strategy I just want to leave us with is one I find particularly helpful, especially when feeling really overwhelmed or kind of, in the heat of the moment. So this is called the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise. And it is really just, you can start with a deep breath, right? So inhale slowly, hold for a moment, right? And then exhale, focusing on your breath. And then for this strategy, we're going to be focusing on our senses, right? So you're going to ask yourself 5 questions and simply just kind of notice your answers without judgment. There's really no right or wrong answers here, right? So starting with, what are 5 things I can see? Right? So kind of looking around the room, just kind of noting your environment, things that are around you. What are 4 things I can feel? Right? So maybe feel your feet on the floor. You feel your shirt, the fabric of your shirt, right? What are 3 things I can hear, right? Maybe you hear kind of the hum of the air conditioning. What are 2 things I can smell? Maybe kind of the fresh air or detergent from your shirt. And then finally, what is 1 thing I can taste? Okay. So this exercise can really function nicely to just gently shift you from whatever you're focusing on to just focus on what is in your immediate environment, right? So bringing you back to the present, calming your mind and your body. Right, and just in terms of take-home messages, thank you all so much for your attention. So really, hopefully, just recognizing the utility or kind of potential for brief interventions that promote social emotional development in children and that also support caregivers and educators, right? And then kind of thinking about how can we nurture the 3 E's and the 3 C's in children and then also in ourselves. All right, and I will conclude there. Thank you so much. If you're interested in learning more about some of the work that we're doing at the CCDMP, please sign up, shameless plug, for our quarterly newsletter to hear more about different events that we have going on. We sometimes do different events for the family. So, for example, we did Inside Out 2, excellent movie. If you haven't seen it already, we probably have all seen it. Inside Out 2 screening. So we try to do different activities. So definitely give us a follow there and keep up to date on anything we have going on. But yes, otherwise I will stop there. And if there are questions, I will be happy to answer any.
So we did get some questions online.
Okay.
So the first one is, how do you measure the internalization of ethical values versus act morally to meet social pressure without internalization?
Yes. Okay. So great question about kind of the internalization process. How do we know? Oh, yes. So the question was, how do we understand if a child has internalized an emotional or their kind of healthy guilt feeling, or sort of their motivation for their engagement in prosocial behavior, or how do we know if this behavior is actually something that's kind of externally motivated? So one way we can assess that is if a child is engaging in those prosocial behaviors without some sort of authority figure present, right? Kind of monitoring or kind of keeping track of the child and what they're doing. So you might kind of naturally observe children in the playground, or, you know, kind of doing different things where they're not maybe aware that they're being watched. Another thing you can do is also just ask children about the thought process behind their behavior, right? So are they saying, oh, I shared my sticker because maybe next time they'll share their sticker with me, which is viewed as more of this kind of tit for tat approach? Or did they say, oh, I shared my sticker because I have a lot of stickers and they didn't have any stickers, right? So that's kind of internalizing this underlying concept of fairness and equality, right? So you can also ask children to articulate and kind of explain why they behaved the way they behaved.
Question in the back?
Oh, yeah. So the question was, are the slides going to be available to review? I'm happy to, I can share them with, yeah. All right, yeah, absolutely. Be recorded. I actually don't, is the online presentation? Okay, yeah, great. So the online, yes, it is, the presentation is saved. So if you want to go back and rewatch, you're absolutely welcome to do that.
You'll be able to view it through the Experiential Education Unit's website. We have a page for lecturing, and there we have all the recorded sessions. UTM, the University of Toronto. So if you look up EEU Lecture Me, then you'll be able to find the page, and then it'll take you, the links will take you to the individual YouTube videos.
Go ahead.
How would you suggest that we, promote pro-social behavior as a family when the current global discourse is perhaps not necessarily pro-social, put it that way?
Yeah, so the question is, how do we promote pro-social behavior in our family when we're surrounded by, news every day about, antisocial behaviors that are going on? So thank you for the question. I think there are still absolutely things that we can do kind of in those relationships that we have, right? I think especially in thinking about talking with children. So I think often as adults we feel kind of this need to sort of protect children or kind of, almost, shield them from any negative news or negative things. But it's actually really helpful, a lot of research shows, to actually talk about injustices or issues where there are not pro-social behaviors going on, and kind of talk through those and sort of help children understand, what are standards for behavior that different people have different standards for behavior, and kind of understanding what are the factors that motivates or sort of inform how we as a family want to treat each other and want to treat other people. So I think it can actually be a really helpful tool for showing children, how they can behave and then how they maybe shouldn't behave and why they shouldn't behave that way. I know I feel like we could have a whole kind of topic lecture kind of focusing on that question. It's not an easy thing. Yeah.
There was another question online that said, will there be further rollout of this training to other regions, like the City of Toronto and educators there, the Halton region?
Oh, thanks for the question. So the question was, will there be further rollout of this training? So we've actually had the opportunity to adapt this training and implement a few other pilots. So with our training approach, we use a community-based research approach. So it's informed by not only past research, but also community-identified needs. So we've worked with different organizations to roll out needs assessments to kind of hear firsthand from caregivers and educators what they see. I feel like when we do our research, we're like, oh, social emotional development is important, but then also talking to educators and caregivers about, what do they see as important? What do they see as, working well in services that they use? And then also where are their gaps, right? So kind of working together with that research application and then also that more bottom-up approach, kind of working with caregivers and educators to inform training. So we've been able to pilot the training with a particular focus on supporting newcomer children and families, and then also with Black children and families, with educators working with Black children and families. And there are, hopefully, we're hoping to really expand and kind of scale up of the training. So definitely, if you follow our newsletter, you'll hopefully hear more news about opportunities and as those come out.
There's a question.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask, is there any limitations to the sharing task where the children would give a story of if they would take the chocolate out of the box or out of their friend's back, which is we know how attitudes will not always translate to behaviors or really knowing what's right or wrong does not necessarily indicate that the child is actually in the role to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. So definitely you're highlighting potential limitations of some of the research just approaches in general, right? Whenever we're inviting a family into the lab, there's things we want to keep in mind, right? Number one, is a family who chooses to come to UTM and participate in a study different from other families who maybe don't have the time or just aren't interested in participating, right? So there's kind of factors there. So who is kind of part of our research studies that's informing the generalizations we're making from it? And then also kind of at the task level, right? So, is the task designed in a way that it's ecologically valid, meaning that how they behave in this particular task might align with how they might behave in some other situation where they're actually in a classroom and there's a child there and they have that chocolate right in front of their faces and smells so good and they really want to eat it, right? So definitely there are potential limitations or kind of factors at play that might differentiate how children would behave. But within kind of research context, we aim to have as much control as possible and then also create those scenarios that feel realistic and kind of, reliable, that children might experience these situations, might have kind of managed a similar situation in the past and then draw on their past behavior to inform kind of their response. But thank you for this question. Yeah.
One more from online.
Okay.
Are the core emotions the same across different cultures?
Oh, great question. So the question is, are the core emotions the same across different cultures? So actually, within those basic emotions, those basic 6 emotions, these are, by research, suggested to be universal emotions, right? So happiness, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, and disgust are basic emotions that we see across virtually all cultures and groups and communities. Where we do see differences is in some of those peripheral emotions or, those emotions as they scale out. So that's why if you're creating an emotion wheel, your emotion wheel might look different than other families' emotion wheels, right? So relying on sort of those experiences, those emotions to kind of keep that in mind. But I think, yeah, we can think of those basic core emotions as universal across kind of humans.
Does anyone have any other questions? go ahead.
So, I mean, you're dealing with the last section policy, so I was wondering, from a policy perspective, how you apply your research,
Mhm.
you mentioned the training for caregivers and educators. But are there any other initiatives you have going on, and do you have any partnerships with local and central government, in that sense?
Yeah, thank you so much. So the question is, so in the name of the Center for Child Development, Mental Health, and Policy, we have policy, right? So what is some of the work that we do that's more policy related? There's one particular project that we actually implemented or held a conference over the summer. It was focused on a particular project that was focused on Rohingya refugee children. So there was an intervention focused on promoting prosocial behavior conducted with Rohingya refugee children in refugee camps. And so we presented the findings from that intervention, and then also invited policy members and as well as humanitarians, so kind of across different sectors, bringing together researchers, humanitarian kind of policy figures to discuss the implications of the research, right? So for that particular project, other ways to incorporate, evidence-based prosocial interventions into programming and supports and services in refugee camp settings, and then also what can we do in Canada, right? So are there policies or efforts that we can implement in Canada and Ontario specifically, right, to support Rohingya refugee children and just refugee children and families more broadly when they are transitioning and moving to Canada. So some of our work focuses on, developing policy briefs, right, that get shared with government and policymakers, right, to kind of inform and translate some of the research that's been done on the topic. So that's definitely kind of a large area of our research. In terms of partnerships, we do partner with Region of Peel, which helps kind of oversee a lot of the early years and child care programming in the Peel region. And we're excited to kind of continue that and expand out and hopefully build more partnerships in kind of that policy and government space.
Okay, as we're nearing the end, maybe just two more questions. So one from online. What does the research say about the impact of environments on developing prosociality in early childhood, particularly being in daycare for most of the day versus being at home with the family?
Okay, so question about how do environments play a role in prosocial behavior, particularly thinking about particularly thinking about the role of being in childcare for prolonged periods of time versus at home. So there is actually been quite a bit of research on this topic. There's a lot of concern about, knowing the really important formative early years, right? So that as that attachment relationship is forming between the baby and their caregiver, right? The importance of that physical presence between the caregiver and the child. But there's actually a lot of research suggesting that, children have capacity to form secure, they do form healthy, secure relationships, even when, they go to childcare. And that, especially that's the case, when that caregiver-child relationship is supportive and nurturing and loving, right? So really the highest predictor is not necessarily if the child is in childcare versus not, but is more so when those parent-child interactions are occurring, what do they look like, right? Are they nurturing? And then another factor to keep in mind, right, if a family needs to use childcare, right, maybe that, opens up resources for the caregiver to then be a better parent, right? If they're working during the day, it's just not feasible to not engage in childcare. So really, the body of research on this topic seems to suggest, particularly for those kind of foundational elements we think of for prosociality, like secure attachments, that children, have that capacity, regardless of kind of some of what those early care environments look like outside of the caregiver-child relationship. That's a bit of a simplification, but the general kind of, yeah. Yeah.
All right, just the last question in the back over there. Sorry, just you.
I'm just wondering, you said that prosociality is kindness.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering what definition do you use the word kindness? Like, why did they come up with this?
Oh.
Is there like a different, is there some different research?
So, So the question is, where did the term prosociality come from? And, is it just this kind of fancy academic term? Is there a distinction between what we think of as prosociality and kindness? I could kind of go into this whole academic lexicon. I feel like academics do ultimately like to have fancy names for things. So kindness, I feel like, is sufficient, really. But there are some subtle differences just in terms of thinking about prosociality and the underlying motivators of prosociality, right? So regardless of kind of the motivations for why a child is helping, if the child helps from that kind of research perspective, that is prosociality. But we might think of, helping behavior that is actually underlyingly manipulative or is kind of done for some sort of ulterior motive. Does that really reflect what we think of as, kindness, right? So there are kind of subtle differences in some of that terminology. So prosociality encapsulates kindness, but does also include some of these more complex forms of prosociality that we might see. Yeah, or they might do it out of kind of this sort of self-interest, or the motivation might look different. Yeah, it's more encompassing, and then that's often so why in research we might ask them, why did you share, or why did you do this, right? To kind of try to tease apart what are those underlying motivations, and then do we see differences in outcomes based on how they respond to that, right?
Well, that concludes our program. Thank you so much to ETM and Professor Speidel for this, for delivering this very informative talk and presentation. Thank you.